Imagine moving into your dream home, only to discover a stack of old cassette tapes hidden inside the attic insulation. You play them expecting maybe old family recordings, but what you hear instead is a woman's voice, scared, whispering, saying someone is watching her. Someone wants her dead. That woman had been murdered 4 years earlier, and no one had ever solved it. Until now. When I first heard about this case, it didn't start with a crime scene. It started with a man buying a house. In the spring of 2018, a man in California purchased an old home that had been sitting vacant for years. From the outside, it looked normal, quiet street, overgrown grass, a dusty for sale sign hanging sideways. The kind of place you'd expect to be filled with old furniture and spiderwebs. Nothing more. But what he found inside that attic, that changed everything. While clearing insulation, he spotted a small plastic bag stuffed behind a wooden beam. Inside were pages torn, handwritten notes. There were also cassette tapes, old and dusty, the kind people don't really use anymore. He was curious, so he played one. That was the moment he realized this house wasn't just abandoned. It was hiding a story that had been forgotten. A story that someone didn't want found. The cassette began with static, then a woman's voice. It wasn't just any voice. It was shaky, panicked. She was whispering as if she was afraid someone might hear her. She said things like, "I think he's in my house again, and they won't believe me." On one tape, she actually named someone. A man named Billy. The attic documents were turned over to the police. That's when they made the connection. This wasn't just some random recording. The voice belonged to Susan Trott, a woman who had been murdered in 2014. Her case had gone cold. That attic, those tapes, they cracked the door back open on a mystery everyone thought was closed. But who was Susan Trott? And what exactly had she been trying to warn the world about? Susan Trott wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to get caught up in something terrifying. She was a writer, a thoughtful, creative woman who lived alone in a quiet California neighborhood. She had friends, a routine, and a love for journaling. That's what made what happened to her so chilling, because she saw it coming, and she wrote it all down. In the months leading up to her death, Susan started telling friends she felt like someone was watching her, following her, breaking into her home. At first, people thought it might be anxiety, or maybe even just an overactive imagination. But she was serious. She even filed a report with the authorities about a neighbor who had been acting strangely. His name, Billy Ray Carr. And the report, it went nowhere. So here's the question. If Susan saw it coming, why didn't anyone help? And why were her warnings buried in an attic, forgotten until 4 years too late? The name in Susan's police report was not unfamiliar to local officers. Billy Ray Carr had been a troubled presence in the neighborhood for years. He was unpredictable, loud, known to roam the streets at night, sometimes muttering to himself. He had a documented history of mental illness and had been in and out of psychiatric care facilities since the early 2000s. Neighbors described him as creepy and off, but no one had ever connected him to anything violent. Not officially. Still, Susan didn't feel safe. She told people he was watching her through her windows, that he followed her to the store. She even believed he had broken into her house, but nothing had been stolen. Just things moved, doors left cracked, lights left on. The scariest part, police didn't believe her. No charges were filed. No investigation was opened. She was told to install cameras and stay alert. That was it. October 3rd, 2014, a Friday. Susan didn't show up for lunch with a friend, something she never did without notice. Her phone went straight to voicemail. No activity on her social media. Her mailbox began to overflow. Concern turned to panic fast. Friends filed a missing person report, and within 48 hours, police entered her home. What they found was unsettling. The house wasn't ransacked, there was no sign of a break in. Her purse, keys, and jacket were inside, but there were two things that stood out. First, her journal open on the kitchen table had one final sentence written inside. He was here again last night. Second, there was a faint smear of blood on the doorframe of the back entrance, barely visible but enough to raise flags. Susan Trott was declared missing, but inside that house it already felt like she was gone. 1 week later, hikers found her body in a ravine outside Sacramento, wrapped in a tarp and hidden beneath brush. No ID, no wallet, just a single shoe. The coroner confirmed it was Susan. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the back of the head. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. The case stalled. Billy Ray Carr was questioned, but there was no hard evidence tying him to anything. No murder weapon, no video footage, nothing that could hold up in court. He denied everything. And just like that, the case went cold. Susan was buried. Her story faded from the headlines, but in the attic of a dusty, abandoned house, her voice kept whispering, waiting for someone to listen. Days after the tapes and notes were turned in, detectives returned to the attic. They weren't done. This time, they brought thermal cameras to scan behind the insulation, and that's when they discovered a second hidden stash buried deeper in the wall. Inside that space, another plastic bag, a notebook warped from heat and time, and a cassette labeled in shaky handwriting. If they find me, it was him. The handwriting matched Susan's known samples, and the contents of that notebook, they were unlike anything in the first batch. These weren't just thoughts, they were observations, logs, dates, and times. She had been documenting Billy's movements for weeks. How often he walked past her house, what he said when he stared at her, what he wore, what he carried. She even wrote, "He has something heavy in his trunk, a bag, a tool." This wasn't paranoia. This was a woman documenting her stalker, and the system had ignored it. One note, tucked in the back of that notebook, caught the attention of investigators. It read, "If I end up dead, check the blue house. He has a key." At the time, Susan's warning meant nothing. But now, the blue house she mentioned was less than 3 blocks away from her old home, and it had been Billy Ray Carr's last known address. Police secured a warrant and went inside. The house had long been vacated, but remnants of his life were still there. Old clothes, rotting furniture, graffiti on the walls. But in the back room, they found something chilling. A hand-drawn map of Susan's neighborhood, and her house was marked with a red X. This was no coincidence. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was premeditation. There was one last tape in the second stash. No label, just the plastic reel and Susan's voice, weaker this time, tired, resigned. "If you're listening, it's too late for me, but it's not too late for the truth." Then silence. The rest of the tape was empty. But that final sentence, that plea, was enough to spark something in the new team handling the case. They reopened the investigation fully. And finally, they looked at Billy Ray Carr not as a harmless neighbor, but as a prime suspect in a long-ignored crime. Reopening a cold case isn't simple. Even with the attic evidence, police needed something solid, something that could stand up in court. So they started tracking Billy again, not just his past, but his present. And what they found, he wasn't living far. In fact, he was still in Sacramento County, couch hopping, unemployed, and drifting between shelters and temporary housing. When questioned again, Billy denied everything just like before. But investigators noticed something different this time. He was nervous, fidgety. His story kept changing. He claimed he didn't know Susan, then said they barely talked, then said she wasn't afraid of him. But he slipped. He mentioned something about her always writing in that little black notebook. A detail never released to the public. That was enough. In late 2018, Billy Ray Carr was arrested and held on suspicion of murder. The trial of Billy Ray Carr began in early 2020. Prosecutors painted a picture of obsession and escalation. They played the tapes in court. The jury listened to Susan's voice, heard her fear, her trembling confessions, her warning. It was like she had come back from the dead to testify against her killer. Her notes, her maps, her timelines, they became the strongest witnesses the case had. The defense tried to argue mental instability. They said Billy was sick, not violent, that he had never laid a hand on anyone, that all of Susan's writings were speculation. But it didn't hold up, because no matter what they argued, Billy had known about the notebook, and the tapes didn't lie. After a tense 3-week trial, the jury took less than 1 day to decide. Guilty. Billy Ray Carr was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Susan Trott. But even in the courtroom, even with the sentence delivered, there was a heavy silence, a feeling no one could shake. Because this case wasn't just about one man's crime. It was about how the system had failed a woman who asked for help over and over and got nothing. It was about a voice buried in an attic, screaming the truth that no one wanted to hear until it was too late. And it made everyone ask, how many more voices like hers are still out there, waiting to be found? After the trial, investigators did something unusual. They went back through every complaint Susan Trott had ever filed, not just the one about Billy Ray Carr, but all of them. They discovered that in the final 6 months of her life, she had contacted law enforcement 7 times. Each report mentioned paranoia, a man outside her house, strange noises in the night, and a deep fear that someone was breaking in when she wasn't home. Each time, it was dismissed, labeled as unconfirmed or worse, mental health concerns. But when they cross-referenced the timestamps of those reports with her journal entries, a clear pattern emerged. Susan had documented the exact same incidents with names, times, even descriptions of clothing. She wasn't imagining it. She was tracking her own killer in real time, and no one listened. One of the officers who had handled Susan's original complaint came forward after the trial. He didn't make excuses. He admitted that back in 2014, they were understaffed, overworked, and, as he put it, too quick to dismiss a scared woman as just paranoid. His voice cracked during the interview. He said, the moment was raw, unscripted, human, and it forced the department to look in the mirror. Because this wasn't just a tragedy, it was a failure. A woman asked for help. She was clear, she was brave, and she died anyway. Public outrage followed the trial. Susan's case went viral. The tapes, the attic, the ignored reports. People demanded change. In 2021, California lawmakers introduced what would become known as Susan's Law, a policy that requires law enforcement to preserve all written and audio documentation of stalking or harassment cases, even if they seem minor. It also created a new requirement. If a person reports being followed more than once by the same individual, an officer must initiate a mandatory risk review. It's not everything, but it's something. And it happened because Susan Trott didn't let her story disappear, not even in death. Months after Billy's conviction, another search of the original house turned up something unexpected. Behind a cabinet in the bedroom, wedged into a cracked floorboard, was a folder wrapped in plastic. Inside, more pages, dozens, torn from journals, all in Susan's handwriting. But these weren't about Billy. They were about how she felt no one believed her, how she began questioning her own mind, wondering if she was overreacting. One sentence repeated across 3 different pages. They'll say I imagined it, but what if I'm right? This was a woman begging anyone to see what was happening before it was too late. And as we read those words now, after everything, we have to ask ourselves, how many people say that same thing every single day and are ignored? In the wake of Susan's case, reporters began investigating other women in the area who had filed stalking complaints in the same 5-year span. What they uncovered was chilling. Multiple reports of similar behavior, men following women home, watching them from parked cars, leaving subtle signs of intrusion. And in most of these cases, the police hadn't followed up. 2 of those women were later victims of assault. One left the state entirely out of fear. Susan's murder wasn't just one tragedy. It was a symptom of a larger blind spot, a system that often doesn't treat fear as evidence until there's blood on the floor. That's why Susan's journals matter so much. Because she wasn't just documenting a crime. She was documenting how easy it is to vanish when no one's listening. In one of the very last pages found in Susan's handwriting, there's no mention of Billy, no mention of fear. Instead, it's a letter. Written in blue ink, the page stained slightly at the corner like someone had touched it with a tear. It read, "If I'm gone, please tell the truth, not just about me, but about what we ignore. We act like fear is a weakness, but fear is information. I was trying to survive. Please tell someone I was trying." That letter has now been framed. It hangs in the Sacramento Police Department's Cold Case Division as a reminder, not of a failure, but of a warning that should have saved a life. Even after Billy Ray Carr was convicted, even after Susan's tapes were heard in court, even after her notes helped change California law, there's one part of this case that still keeps people up at night. In one of her earliest journal entries, weeks before she was killed, Susan described a second person, a man she referred to only as the Shadow. She wrote, "Billy is always watching, but the Shadow, he speaks to him. I hear them outside sometimes. 2 voices, one low, one laughing." That detail never came up at trial. It was brushed off. Investigators couldn't find evidence of anyone else but the truth. They never found proof there wasn't someone else either. And when the final cassette was enhanced by audio experts, right after Susan's whisper, a second voice is faintly heard. Not speaking, just breathing. No one knows who it was. The attic where everything was found is empty now. No tapes, no notebooks, just beams, dust, and silence. But that silence feels heavy, not peaceful, unfinished. Because Susan Trott left behind more than evidence. She left behind a mirror and asked us to look, to ask why so many people who cry out for help are told they're too sensitive. Why women like Susan are so often forced to prove their fear before it's taken seriously. And why sometimes it takes a dead woman's voice in a cassette tape for the truth to finally be heard. So I leave you with this. If someone you know said, "I think someone's following me," would you believe them? Or would you wait until it was too late?